I'm going to introduce a neighbor of mine that I ran across in my subdivision about a year ago. I was talking about Willow Run, and he came up and told me he used to fly for TWA. And he flew the Constellation. I says, we're getting one of those. It's called the EC-121. Anybody here been through our EC-121, looked inside of it? Isn't that an awesome? That bird is preserved just like it was when it flew its last mission 35 years ago. That's just a fantastic thing to bring in the museum. We're very excited to have Bob Trumpolt with us. Did I do it good? No, Polt. Trumpolt. Okay. Yes, it should be spelled out if not a former TWA flight engineer on the Lockheed Constellation. Of course, that's the civilian version of our EC-120. Bob will be talking about his career and what it was like to fly in the Constellation and his duties as an engineer and his career at TWA. But before we do that, let's look at some videos to put us in the mood.
The Lockheed Constellation was one of the most important aircraft in the rebuilding of the airline industry after the war. Often described as the Queen of the Skies, it was the most powerful and advanced airliner of its time. A combination of many technical innovations came together in a true success story. In addition, the distinctive curves of the fuselage and the perfect balance of the design made the plane a thing of beauty and grace. Large four-engine transports are not always aesthetic, but the Connie's lines demand admiration. The Constellation was the pinnacle of piston engine transport design and broke new ground in both its civil and military variants. However, its career overlapped into the jet age, and the appearance of the new technology brought down a premature curtain on its lifespan.
Just one little trivia on the Constellation. The Constellation started out as the XB-31. Did you know that?
No, sir, I didn't.
Yeah, the Army put out a proposal for a long-range bomber in January of 1939. Boeing, Douglas, Consolidated, and Lockheed all bid. One was the XB-29, the XB-30 was the Douglas version, the XB-31 was the Lockheed version, and that was the start of the Constellation. They dropped out after about 9 months, but they had this airplane they started to design, and they continued developing it, and it turned into the Constellation. A lot of people ask, why does it have 3 tails? The B-24 has 2 tails, the B-25 has 2 tails. Is because the Army put a specification on the airplanes, our hangar doors are only 20 feet tall. No airplane can have a tail higher than 20 feet. The DC-4 was developed with 2 tails, and finally somebody went, you know what? It's easier to build a new hangar than it is a quadruple-tailed airplane. So they put bigger doors on them. And with that introduction, Bob, come on up.
That beautiful new movie that the museum made is a hard act to follow, I'll tell you that. So, I hope everybody can hear me. Folks, the hat I am wearing and this nice pin here are gifts from the museum for a donation of $121 for the C-121 refurbishment going on near the east ramp right now. It takes a lot of money to complete the restoration of a Connie, so any amount that you might want to give will be greatly appreciated. Well, good evening, everyone. In creating this presentation, I realized that you cannot speak about the Connie without connecting her to Transworld Airlines, and most importantly, some background on Connie's creator, Howard Hughes. So here goes. I was so fortunate and honored to have served my great airline, starting out as a 30-year-old newbie flight engineer on the L749, 749A, and the fabulous 1049G Super Connie. It was hard work, involving 5 below zero, dark 30 pre-flights, sticking 6 fuel tanks, a hydraulic tank, and 4 oil tanks on frosty and slippery wings. Then down the ladder to the wheel well bays, etc., etc. I loved it all. But first, I want to give you an overview of Connie's history, followed by how I got to fit into her life and times, and finally, the training regimen to qualify for what was, in my view, a quite unique crew position in a very special airplane. Okay, now I got to do this. Early airline history. Reaching back to the beginning of scheduled airline passenger travel, the Ford Trimotor was replaced by the venerable DC-3, which became a hero of World War II. The speed, comfort, and passenger capacity greatly increased, finally making the carriage of passengers, and not just the United States mail, a profitable venture. However, the advent of the Connie created a giant leap in speed, pressurized comfort, and ocean crossing range, not to mention a 4 times increase in passenger capacity. Now on to our story of this big, beautiful doll. Question: how many of you folks have flown on a Connie? Hey, we got some hands. Look at that, look at that. Anyone here flew as a military crew member on the old girl? Oh my gosh. I better be careful what I say. I got plenty of critics out here to see any mistakes. Well, it's taken me 8 months to put this thing together with my dear wife's help, so here goes. We'll start off with a kinder, gentler era. Put yourself back in the 1950s and 60s. By late 1964, Connie was relegated to flying from the East Coast throughout the Midwest, from Boston to Kansas City, and many cities in between. 4 models were in service: the L749, 749A, that wonderful L1049G, and the big guy, the L1649A, which had been relegated to flying freight. The passengers were so nice. Dad in a 3-piece suit, Mother with a little hat and white gloves, children scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best. The cockpit door was unlocked, and a flight attendant, we called them stews, might bring a nervous businessman or a wide-eyed child up front for a visit. The captain would tailor his chat to each, sending the businessman back looking much happier having seen up front, and of course, the youngster enthralled with all the noise, lights, dials, and excitement up there in the wheelhouse. It was a wonderful PR moment, now long lost to history, along with the romance of flying in Connie, or any other airliner I might add. You all know that. So what was it like for our passengers? Picture this. It's night. The engines are brought up to takeoff power. A mighty roar and a yellow stream of fire reaches back from those big stacks. As the power is reduced for climb, the fire stream begins to crawl back into the stacks. Later, As power is further reduced for cruise, engine roar subsides, props are fine-tuned to a smooth hum, and the short flame pattern turns a pretty blue. Now it's time for the approach to landing. I know, short flight. Flaps and landing gear are extended, and power is increased to a loud rumble with those mighty props digging in. And suddenly, the small blue flame leaps out in a long yellow trail of fire. Wow! A loud and visual display of thunder and lightning as Connie makes her final prep for landing. Every flight is a great adventure for our passengers and for me too. Connie's story cannot be told without revealing some of the machinations of one Howard Robard Hughes. In the late 30s, TWA was asking the Douglas and Lockheed aircraft companies to design a 40 or so passenger airplane. The Douglas initial design even sported a double tail. But Hughes, holding 30% of the TWA stock, told TWA, "I'm going to contract with Lockheed to build a plane twice as big. It will have a pressurized cabin and tricycle landing gear. And oh, by the way, you will not buy them from Lockheed, you will buy them from me." Connie's tapered wings are a direct copy of the smaller P-38 wings. A young aeronautical engineer named Kelly Johnson was already on the job. Many of you may know Kelly from the Skunk Works that produced the U-2 and all of those wonderful spy planes. Oh, by the way, that's Howard flying an O-49 Connie way back in 1945. So now the stage is set. Connie's history. This is my version of the golden age of flight. 84 orders come in, 40 each from TWA and Pan American for Model 49. The United States Army Air Force ordered 313 what they call C-69s. It had 2,200 horsepower, Wright double cyclone engines. But only 15 of those C-69s were delivered by war's end so that the airlines could actually repaint these airplanes in their own livery and have them going by November of 1945. 1945-46, Pan American gets the nod to go to Bermuda. TWA is authorized to fly New York to Paris. At this time, it took nearly 20 hours with refueling stops at Gander, Newfoundland, and Shannon, Ireland. And I got to say just one thing about the duty-free shop in Shannon. Even up into the jet age, of all the duty-free shops in the world, the passengers used to run off the plane to get into that store. It was the best. I was too busy checking the Connie. I didn't get in there. TWA soon added Cairo, Lisbon, Madrid, and also New York to Los Angeles. TWA was almost out of cash at this time, however. They desperately needed a white knight to come riding into their rescue, but nobody was coming except Uncle Howard. That's the moniker that all the TWA crew members put on Mr. Hughes. To us, he was Uncle Howard. TWA's president, Jack Fry, wanted to float a bond issue for $110 million. They could no longer pay the airline's fuel bill. And there was a 25-day pilot strike on top of that. Well, Howard said, "No, you're not going to do that. I will loan you $10 million. Remember now, folks, these are 1946 bucks. with the stipulation that TWA President Jack Fry had to go. That was a bad idea, but the company had no choice. By the way, in 1946, Hughes Tool Company, which you may know his father left him a multi-million-dollar company that made fantastic drill bits for the oil industry. And that started off Howard's march towards one of the first billionaires in the world. Anyway, Hughes Tool was making $42,000 a day when the average U.S. yearly salary was $8,000. In 1948, Hughes Tool Company's sales reached $100 million. That's $1.5 billion today. This was the first time in its history. By the end of 1946, Howard Hughes owned 46% of TWA stock. His personal fortune had risen to $520 million, 1946 dollars. That is $6.5 billion today. This was at a time when only 381 people in the United States were mere millionaires. By 1956, Hughes increased his ownership of TWA, reaching 78.2%. In late 55, I'm kind of skipping around here, but in late 55, with the other airlines ordering Boeing 707 and DC-8 jets, Uncle Howard did nothing. And just when it looked like TWA was left behind for good, in June of 56, Hughes Tool Company was obligated by Hughes for a $400 million order for Boeing 707s, Convair 880s, and spare Pratt & Whitney engines, the largest single order in the history of aviation. That amounts to $3.582 billion today. 1946, the L-749 with 2,500 horsepower rights and additional fuel capacity, allowing maximum takeoff weight increase from 86,250 pounds to 102,000 pounds. She beat other airlines' unpressurized DC-4s by 2 to 3 hours between New York and L.A., where it took the Connie 11 hours, including a fuel stop. However, the DC-6 was a real contender. The L-749A was TWA's longest-serving Constellation model with 19-plus years of service between March 1948 and May 1967. All models were carbureted to this time. 1950, L-1049 Super Connie with Wright R-3350s, 2,700 horsepower engines, and the fuselage was stretched 18 feet 4 inches. Gross weight increased to 120,000 pounds, and rectangular windows were replacing the old-fashioned circular ones, keep up with Douglas and Boeing. 1953, the L-1049C, now with turbo compound 3,250 horsepower R-3350 engines with 3 blow-down power recovery turbines called PRTs. We call them parts recovery tubs. These PRTs converted exhaust gases into another 550 horsepower per engine for takeoff. Fuel consumption was reduced by 20% due to fuel injection. Flight tests began in February, 4 months ahead of the DC-7. Weight now up to 133,000 pounds. Just like an old person eating too many chocolates, I guess. At this time, the joke around the pilot's flight planning room was the world's best trimotors, thanks to those pesky new turbo compound engines. Those PRTs had a nasty habit of catching fire, but they finally solved that, and it did help to power the bigger airplane. Two important stops once a month. Well, that's not the right one. There we go. Two important stops once a month were Cairo and Bombay. Toothbrushes were used by a small army of workers to clean the interior and polish the bare aluminum skin to a gleaming finish. Ah, best model. Be still my beating heart. I love this airplane so much. The L-1049G, the Super G. Now she's sporting 3,400 horsepower engines, and 600-gallon tip tanks have been added to increase her total gallonage to 7,750. This was the first airliner to make a schedule based on a 350-mile-an-hour cruising speed. It could outrun a Grumman Wildcat and the Mitsubishi Zero. 579 Super Connies were built between 1951 and 58, 259 to commercial operators and the rest to the military. Some of these grossed out at 140,000 pounds. Another special piece of equipment on the L-1049Gs was the engine analyzer, or as we flight engineers called it, the Chinese TV. The flight engineer could see every spark plug and electric unit on the engines, which was a big part of the engine run-up before takeoff. Some of the captains would get antsy waiting for the flight engineer to complete this lengthy procedure. We had fistfuls of cue cards for all the possible maladies. One day I saw a double shorted secondary, meaning a busted cylinder and shutdown. 1957. Not sure I'm in the right place, but we'll keep going. Yeah, we are. The L-1649A, that's the biggest Connie, the last one that Lockheed built, called the Starliner. It carried 9,600 gallons of fuel with a max takeoff weight of 156,000 pounds. Initial deliveries were made in 1957, a year after the DC-7C and just 16 months before the 707. You can kind of see the end of the Connies coming, can't you? Turboprops might have saved her for a while. TWA flew the polar route from London to San Francisco and Los Angeles. You had to fly the Great Circle route. That's the shortest way to get from one place to the other. The crew complement was 4 pilots, 2 flight engineers, 2 navigators, and a couple of radio operators. Los Angeles to London was scheduled 19 hours and 10 minutes. Return to San Francisco was 21 hours and 5 minutes. Only 44 of these big 1649As were built, and they were the last piston engine airliners produced by Lockheed for the airlines. Now, about those turboprops, turns out a few of them did find their way onto Connie's wings. Allison Engines was building the first test articles for the proposed C-130 Herky aircraft. These early turboprops were expiring in 15 to 20 hours. So a 2-year test schedule was initiated to get them up to acceptance by the Air Force, with Connie as the star of the show. Well, I got the ground school training on that big bird, but the 707 relegated the 1649 to flying freight, and I moved on to the jet. Years later, I got the ground school for that polar flight in the Boeing 707, but wouldn't you know, the Boeing 747 started a few weeks early and canceled my around-the-world trip. Well, things happen. A total of 856 military and civilian Connies and Super Connies had been produced when production ended in 1958. During Connie's lifetime of approximately 27 years of scheduled operation, she set 45 major commercial airline speed records. TWA operated 146 Connies at one time, more than any other airline. Oh, I got to go on here. Okay, there we are. In 1944, Orville Wright was invited for a ride in the Connie. He sat for a half hour in the pilot's seat, the only commercial airliner to be flown by the pioneer of flight. Now we'll go back a little bit. Down in the lower left, that's probably about what the museum's Connie is going to look like when she gets all dressed up. That's what she looks like out there in the yard. If you go over by the east ramp near the fence, you can see her parked there, and that's where they're working on her. And eventually she'll go in the hangar that they're refurbishing, and she'll be a wonderful permanent exhibit. So let's see where we are now. Okay, here we are. Just a note on caring for Connie. At 10,000 hours of operation, Connie comes home to the giant TWA overhaul base at Mid-Continent Airport near Kansas City for 6 days and nights. An army of mechanics and technicians swarm over her. The interior is stripped down to bare metal. All the instruments come out for recalibration. Newly overhauled engines and props are installed. Speaking of those propellers, they were balanced and polished to a mirror image. I viewed an old TWA film where a worker places a paper matchbook near the tip of a prop blade. The prop starts to rotate on its test stand. As soon as I find my place. And those jet engine manufacturers think they've got a perfectly balanced product. Of course, when Connie comes out of this massive overhaul, we crew members are ready for any surprises in her first few hours back on the line. So how many Connies are flying today? My research shows Save a Connie is currently down for maintenance in Kansas City. A C-121, like the museum has, is flying at Yanks Air Museum in Chino, California. A Breitling Watches Connie flies in Switzerland. A KLM Connie in Holland. And up in Maine, believe it or not, a Lufthansa Connie, they even had to build a special hangar for her. She is being refurbished up there, and she'll be flown to Europe, and she will participate in air shows overseas. Also, President Eisenhower's Columbine number 2 flew in 2016. His number 1 and 3 Connies are in museums. His Columbine number 2, which was number 8610, had a near collision with a civilian aircraft, also number 8610. And that's when they dropped the 8610, and Ike's Connie became the first Air Force One. Ah, there we go. Save a Connie, May 1986. L1049H Super Connie, November 6937 Charlie, had been rotting away in a Mesa, Arizona boneyard for a number of years. A volunteer group of veteran TWA mechanics spent 3,000 man-hours preparing it for a ferry flight to downtown Kansas City Airport. 3 years of restoration including replacing 700 pounds of old tube-type gear with 70 pounds of digital avionics. 4 main tires, worth $900 apiece, were donated by B.F. Goodrich. New batteries were $500. Pardon me. Must have been something I ate. New batteries were $500 each. For a number of years, the Super Connie flew the U.S. Air Show circuit, but she has been grounded since 2005 and is currently on static display in Kansas City. She burned 400 gallons per hour in cruise, with the engines detuned for 100 low lead, because that's the only fuel we got now. She burned 2.5 gallons per hour per engine of oil. I think when you saw the startup, you saw about 4 gallons of ex-dinosaur disappear right there. She had a 41-gallon oil tank kept at a minimum of 31 gallons. I don't know how you could do that in some of the flights we had, but today the Saver Connie lives with a Martin 404, a DC-3, and a Lockheed L-1011, all in TWA livery at the Airline History Museum located at the downtown Kansas City airport across the field from the TWA Museum. So if you can get out there in your travels, it's a double whammy. I think you'd really enjoy it. The TWA Saver Connie is the only airworthy ex-civilian aircraft. All the others, about 55 total survivors, are ex-military. So how did I get a shot at that coveted job? Check this out. This is not my father's Connie, believe me. Up there on the top of the glass shield is a gorgeous Garmin GPS, and back when I was flying the Connie, that was a glint in some engineer's eye. And those beautiful David Clark headsets they got on their ears. We had these museum pieces from the 40s on TWA. Okay. So how did I get a shot at that coveted job? 1948. Age 13, I joined the Civil Air Patrol. That was the minimum age at that time. I got a little bit of ground school, and beyond that, a tiny book I got from the Piper Corporation called How to Fly a Piper Cub was the absolute sum and substance of my ground school. I'm not proud of that, and I sure as heck didn't know anything about flying, but as a poor farm kid, you do what you have to do. So 1950, age 15, I get the line boy job at Bolton, Massachusetts Airport. The International Golf Course now occupies the airport site. Pardon all golfers. It was home to 12 training aircraft from Aronca Champs, Taylor Crafts, Cessna 140s, and a twin-engine Cessna T-50 Bobcat, a Fairchild PT-19, and a Commonwealth Sky Ranger. It was a very busy GA airport, mostly training GI Bill students, and you might remember the GI Bill program for the returning folks from World War II was in high gear at that time. I rode my single-speed bike 8 miles over hill and dale up to the airport. Some words about line boys. Please indulge me on this. Back in the day, they were at the very bottom of the airport food chain, to put it mildly. My boss, the colorful airport manager known as Pappy, who gave this 15-year-old kid only 2 instructions for my job at the airport. First, he said, when you go to the hangar for a case of oil, or go to gas up a plane or prop it, don't forget none of the planes had electrical systems, I don't want to see you walking. You will run to the hangar or the gas pump, and if you have nothing to do, Go back to the shop and help the mechanic. I don't want to see you hanging around here. Stay busy or go home. The other edict was, if I ever see you smoking around here, you'll be kicked off this field. And for that I thank him, because I never acquired the smoking habit. So what about the fate of the airport line boy? My personal knowledge of the breed was, my cousin, who handed me the line boy job when he entered the Air Force as an airman basic, he wound up flying F-86Ds in Alaska and retired as a Boeing 747 captain for Flying Tiger Line. Another cousin used his line boy work to buy a Fairchild PT-19. He got his commercial, and he wound up flying Connies and Boeing 727s for Eastern. And yet another line boy at a local airstrip became chief pilot for Japan Airlines cargo division in Anchorage, Alaska. I think they did all right. And I, of course, scratched and clawed my way up to a career with TWA. But the incredible journey of one gentleman from Wapakoneta, Ohio, puts all of us other line boys to the pale. I am, of course, speaking of Neil Armstrong. If you are driving on I-75 between Detroit and Cincinnati, about halfway between, you will see the Neil Armstrong Museum, visible on the west side of the highway. As I was entering the museum, I was astonished to see an Aranca Champ fastened to the wall and Neil's single-speed bike attached beside it. Holy aileron, Batman! Neil started his trip to the moon riding his bike to his line boy job and learning to fly in a Champ just like me. And with that, folks, he became world famous, and I obviously didn't. And for good reason. But hey, it was fun to see what a line boy with guts and determination could achieve. I hope you indulge me on that little deal. Okay, 1950 here. My first solo in a tailorcraft in December of 1950, just turned 16, having received the grand total of 5 hours and 30 minutes of what the GI Bill flight instructors called dual. It was mostly he flew it up to cruise altitude, and then he would shout at me, "Okay, kid, grab the controls and fool around." After 15 or 20 minutes of this, he would fly the airplane back to the airport. Now, if that's your idea of flight instruction, so be it. I knew nothing. So, I got an hour in a Champ in May. I got 2 flights in October in a tailorcraft and 4 flights in a tailorcraft in November. This was my total compensation for 7.5 months' work at the airport. I did not know how to drive an automobile, and for sure, I hardly knew anything about flying. But when the boss said, "Fly or go home," I flew. Spring 1952, got my private pilot license and a Champ on skis. As a 17-year-old high school senior, I bought a 40 horsepower 1936 J2 Taylor Cub, single ignition. It had no brakes, for $150. Get ready for this. It included a complete spare engine in a crate. It was rotting away on its ropes at a local airfield, unlicensed, for I don't know how long. But I took it over to a Cub guru mechanic, and he licensed it for $75. To prove how ancient I am, I received 32 hours and 35 minutes in a Link trainer, like the ones they got out here in the museum, in the mid-1950s. Yep, flying the old four-course low-frequency radio range. Hey, I couldn't afford to rent a real airplane. 1956, first charter flight job. Now we're getting somewhere, right? Over the winter of 1956-57, flying 503 hours in exactly 6 months out of a small gravel strip in Connecticut near New London, across the Thames River from Electric Boat Company, makers of the atomic submarines. I ranged from the Canadian border to Pittsburgh and Philly. Nasty weather. The boss says, of course I didn't have an instrument rating, but the boss says, deliver your fare or you're done here. So I became very flexible and did a lot of interesting things. But hey, the plane survived and I'm here. Well, the job called for flying 6 days a week for $50 plus $1 per hour flying time. All flown in a tripacer. I flew electric boat executives, great horned owls, scallops, machinery, you name it, I flew it. It's amazing what that short wing airplane could do. We used to overload it with 650 pounds of scallops, and I would just fly in ground effect up the Long Island Sound off the water. When I finally made landfall around Point Judith, I was probably up to 1,000 feet. And guess where I'm taking the scallops, ladies and gentlemen? To the scallop capital of the world. Why did I take them out of Long Island and take them up there? I didn't care. I was getting $1 an hour. They were so overloaded that I remember the boss told me, be very, very careful when you turn off the runway because the plane is overloaded and you can run a tire off the rim. And guess what? One of the pilots did. And it was so funny because when I got to the ramp, because the landing gear has bungees to take care of the shock absorbing on the landing gear, I had to get out and grab the struts and pump the wings up. It was quite a deal, quite a funny thing. I remember one morning when this big burly fisherman, he opened up one of the 13 tins of scallops. And this was in the morning. I only had one meal a day because I had no money, which was a dinner at Howard Johnson's late at night. So I have nothing in my stomach. This big guy reaches in, grabs one of those raw scallops. Man, I'm telling you, I just about lost it. Oh. Oh. Anyway, let's jump up to 1964. By now I had spent 14 years of flight instructing, charter flying for a Beechcraft dealer, and had also worked 7.5 years as a Civil Aeronautics Administration and later FAA control tower operator in Cleveland, Ohio, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Bradley Field in Windsor Locks, Connecticut. Finally, in the fall of 1964, having amassed the staggering sum of 1,960 flying time hours, I received a telegram from TWA and a one-way airline ticket to report on October 26 for 2 days at downtown Kansas City Airport for medical and psychological testing. No giggles, please. 28th of October, 1964. Welcome to the last class of Connie engineers. What? Engineers? I'm a pilot. I signed on as a pilot. A groan from the 15 military guys in my class of 18. They had just been released from the military service due to McNamara's base closures around the country. TWA was using the dartboard method of setting up various pilot flight engineer training. Besides Connie flight engineer and first officer classes, there were classes set up for Boeing 707, Convair 880, and Boeing 727 first officers and jet flight engineers, and of course, all those flight attendants. The training center was a very busy place. Let me tell you, it was bursting at the seams. Thanks to a big feud going on between the Flight Engineers International Association, the FEIA, and Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, a new cockpit position called second officer was mandated, with the sole duties consisting of keeping the jet's flight log and taking coffee orders. True story. You can't make this stuff up. Those folks did not fare well at the end of their one-year probationary period when they were put in the simulator, and many did not make it. Other aspects of this fight was the old mechanic flight engineers were given a chance to obtain a commercial and an instrument rating at a training base on Long Island at company expense. These old-timers would often say, "All those pilots do is watch the autopilot and drink coffee. I've got a real job." Well, we lost a bunch more of them when they were thrown in the little DC-9 simulator, and they never even got to the airplane before they were legally fired. Some of them became very competent captains later on, but not many. On their probation period, first officers had 1 year where the union couldn't help them. If you look cross-eyed at a captain, he could turn you in. Most unfairly, the probationary period for flight engineers was 1.5 years. So more jeopardy plus no line pay for an extra 6 months. Flight engineers' pay, by the way, was $500 a month. The FAA had sent me a check for $3,100 from my ATC retirement account. With a mortgage on an empty house in Connecticut, paying room and board for my wife, 5-year-old daughter, and 4-month-old son living with their parents near Cape Cod, my own subsistence sharing an apartment with 3 other classmates, and later a room at the smelly YMCA in Queens, New York, just about depleted my savings. My wife had our only car, so it was the city bus for me. Okay, now we get to study buddies and apartment dwellers. Each guy teamed up with another to facilitate back and forth training after hours to drive all the minutia into our heads. As none of us had much money, we also had to pick roommates. So here's how all that went down. 4 of us gravitated towards each other, and here's the result. I, the Yankee Bean, and almost 30, the current cutoff, for training, by the way, for hiring, teamed up with the youngest of us 4, Larry. Larry was the least qualified, coming from the rear seat of a B-47 bomber, where he was responsible for navigation, dropping bombs, and electronic countermeasures. "How much actual flying did you get?" says I. "Once a month I got in the front seat, made 3 approaches and maybe 2 landings, and that was it," says he. Larry married an admiral's daughter, but his family makeup was really strange. His Irish father played in a Dixieland jazz band in Puerto Rico. And his Puerto Rican mother was a RN right there in Kansas City. Go figure. The remaining 2 roommates were highly qualified pilots. Bachelor Wayne had been a DC-3 captain for West Coast Airlines out in the Pacific Northwest, and also a T-33 flight instructor in the USAF Reserves. Bachelor Jerry was a Twin Beach flight instructor in the Royal Canadian Air Force. We went looking for a rental and found a 2-bedroom with 4 twin beds, a little kitchen, and a bathroom. It had to be situated downtown near the Stu Zoo, which was a hotel TWA used exclusively for flight attendant trainees. Wayne would bring ladies back to our apartment for introductions, and then off they went into the night while Larry and I sweated over our study materials late into the evening. For transportation to the training center, Larry rode in Wayne's Corvette, and I teamed up with Jerry in his VW. About that bug. Jerry's Beetle was light green, although it was hard to tell due to the accumulation of tar, mud, and a general coating of crud. After a few weeks of commuting in this little monster, and by the way, it's wintertime and there ain't no heater in those things, I asked Jerry why all 4 fenders were crushed in, and how about that big dent on the roof? He chuckled and said, well, when my instructor buddies heard I was resigning from the RCAF and going down to the States to fly for TWA, the boys decided to throw a party for me. Down at the old club, when everybody was well lubricated, someone said, hey, Jerry's car has got to join the party. With that, the Beetle was rammed through the big oak club doors, smashing in all 4 fenders. Then they grabbed me and slammed me down on the roof. That's how the dent get there, says he. What a character. The training. It was a very intensive 4.5-month syllabus. It took Larry and I a 7-day-a-week, 10 to 12 hours a day of class and study time to absorb it all. No let-up. A breakdown of the training. Formal ground school lasted 7 very intensive weeks. Then came 45 hours and 30 minutes and a 1049G procedures trainer with 28 hours at the controls. The fellow I was paired with, he was an ex-controller from Anchorage, Alaska, was fired. The procedure was, we would each be asked a question in turn. It got so bad that the guy would stare at the panel, and the instructor would snap his fingers, meaning, Bob, answer his question. Double jeopardy. So I ended up with all the panel time and, of course, all the questions. I couldn't imagine that a guy with a wife and 5 kids could be so lazy, but there he was. An FAA check ride called Emergency Review Ride finished the simulator training, as TWA called it. Next up, 7 hours of panel time in empty Connies. Yay, the real thing, finally! Plus 7 hours and 45 minutes observer time watching the other guy sweat, although it was a frigid Kansas City winter weather. Of course, another FAA check ride to get through this phase. Because TWA hired us as pilot engineers, they gave us 3 touch and goes in a weary 1049G Connie. Boy, what a thrill that was for a little light plane guy like me. A word about our check airman, John. He worked out of the Kansas City FAA office. He bragged about TWA's tough training course to his fellow inspectors. You guys can check the other airlines. I only want to check TWA. Well, you can imagine how that went over. But John was no Santa Claus. He checked you to the standards that TWA demanded, which was a lot tougher than the feds. But complete heresy reigned when, after a check ride was done, John would ask the captain for some panel time. A Fed touching the controls of an actual airplane? Are you kidding? But that's what a wonderful guy he was. So now it's time to finally say goodbye to old Kansas City and start line training at Newark and JFK domiciles. Not so fast. On our last class day, the instructor announced, you have to pass a Morse code test before you leave. Well, luckily, boy, believe me, there was some guys there that were really groaning. They were still there when I left. But luckily, that's one thing that I knew pretty well. So I zipped through that, picked up my one-way ticket to New York, and headed east. The New York training took 91 hours and 30 minutes of panel time with an instructor in L749, 749A, and 1049Gs to check out with a final 2-day, 6-leg trip with the check engineer, flying paying customers all the way. At this time, just after the checkout was completed, the check engineer asked me if I would like to be a line instructor. I said, "Are you kidding? I just got checked out on the Connie." He says, "Well, I hear that you got a civilian flight instructor rating and you like to teach." What a bunch of blarney. But I did like to teach. And he said, "Well, look, on top of that, you get another $150 a month." I said, "I'm in. I'll take it." Ah, yes. Now we're getting somewhere, right? Pre-flighting the Connie. 2 hours before engine start, while the two pilots were in the warm confines of the flight planning room, drinking coffee, etc., yours truly hauled his big Samsonite suitcase and an even heavier brain bag containing several large manuals for each Connie type, plus a toolkit. This was schlepped up a skinny 12-foot engineer ladder through the small engineer door to be deposited in the cockpit. I would start with the cabin interior before the passengers arrived. If it was a very cold day, I would ask one of the flight attendants to sit in the flight engineer seat and watch 2 red lights. If they illuminated, it meant the avgas-fueled heaters had caught fire. And she was instructed to push the related fire extinguisher buttons and holler for me, as I would be on the ramp, under the airplane, or up on the wings doing my pre-flight. Pushing the engineer ladder behind the wing root, I would step up on the wing. If it was slippery with frost or water, I was instructed to hold the big screwdriver in my right hand, and if I felt I was losing my footing, punch the screwdriver into the wing. It's a long way down. A mechanic at LaGuardia slipped off a wing one night, broke his neck, and died. All maintenance would do is put a patch of 500-mile-an-hour Mylar tape on the hole. I found out it works. I once flew a Boeing 707 from London to New York after a lightning strike had bored a hole in the wingtip. It was still there when I got to New York. Up on the wing, I would stick 3 gas tanks, 2 oil tanks, and on the initial leg, the hydraulic reservoir in the left wing root. Maybe it was just to put the fear into us, but we were told that if we did not secure the door properly, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Anyway, you were very alert to your surroundings up on those wings. Now do all this except the hydraulic reservoir in the other wing. Then it's down the ladder in a lengthy pre-flight of the underside of the aircraft, especially in the landing gear bay, exposing all kinds of potential for leaking hydraulic fuel lines, oil lines, landing gear, outflow valves, etc. Lots to check. Then back up the ladder to the cockpit to relieve the flight attendant and set up the flight engineer panel, study the discrepancies written up in the logbook by the mechanics so I can brief the captain. Truth to tell, you could throw the co-pilot out the window, as it took only 2 people to operate a Connie. That's the way Howard Hughes designed it. The captain to fly it, and the flight engineer to run all the systems. The only engine controls available to the captain were 4 throttles and a single switch to gang the propellers down in case of an overspeed. The most awkward posture occurred on takeoff, with your right arm extended downward to reach the pressurization switch to close up the cabin just after takeoff, while simultaneously reaching up with your left arm to keep a hand on the throttles. Close-up on the L1049G was somewhat more automatic, so not quite so much of a stretch. Engine starting sequence was 3, 4, 2, and 1, just like the movie you saw, with the co-pilot calling out 8 blades and then contact 3, whereupon the co-pilot or captain would turn the mag switch to both, and the reward would be big clouds of smoke and some fire as the big old right began to wake up, cylinder by cylinder. The only time the flight engineer got to observe the engines was number 3 and 4, and then only if it was a 1049G with the porthole in the crew door. Otherwise, there were no visuals for the engineer, unless he walked back to the cabin area and peered out past a passenger. We sometimes did this as a PR movement to allay the fears of a passenger who told a flight attendant, "There's a lot of oil streaming out of that engine." Yep, there sure is. Along with the nighttime pyrotechnics show, once in a while in an attempt to evade ice and/or turbulence, the captain would decide to climb, necessitating the dreaded blower shift. What a circus this was. First, the captain makes an announcement to the passengers about this weird thing that is about to happen. He explains that sound levels will decrease as power on 2 engines at a time will be reduced to idle while the flight engineer shifts blowers, or superchargers, and they will feel a thump as the blowers shift for more climb power. The aircraft is usually pretty far up in its sweet spot at maybe 14 to 16,000 feet when I get the nod from the skipper. Pulling back number 1 and 4 throttles, I'm yanking those big blower handles, which are those guys right there, down and praying that they both shift into high boost. Now, while I'm doing this, the aircraft is starting a nose-high mush, trying to maintain altitude. As quick as I can, when I hear the thump-thump, I bring number 1 and 4 back to climb power and bring number 2 and 3 throttles to idle and repeat the procedure. All this time, poor old Connie is mushing along, usually starting to fall out of her altitude. And by the time this thing is completed, even at climb power, we are just mushing along, trying to gain climb speed again. The worst day I ever had with the procedure was when I had a flight engineer student on his very first line trip. He did not 1, but 2 of them. Being new to the procedure, he was naturally a little slow. And to top it off, the reason for the blower shifts were we were attempting to climb out of icing. Most students didn't get to do one for real until they were checked out early in their Connie days. Very interesting occupation for sure. By the way, for you modern-day pilots, lean of peak mixture control was invented by the airlines. Stoichiometric was introduced to my aviation vocabulary. You adjusted the mixtures just so for peak efficiency and economy, but it had to be finessed just right or major damage could happen. Sad day. Meltdown. Come spring of 1967, and one of my classmates was the flight engineer on the last revenue flight of the Connie from JFK to St. Louis with a number of stops on the way. There was a retirement ceremony for her, and my friend received a nice desk model of a Hamilton standard propeller and other stuff. Soon the Connies were all flown to Mid-Continent Airport near Kansas City and home to TWA's giant maintenance base. There, the once proud flagships were crushed and fed into a huge smelter, reducing them to aluminum ingots. Beer cans. Terrible fate. The same fate awaited my beloved Boeing 707s 15 years later. However, in this case, the engines were mated to American Airlines airframes to augment the fleet of United States Air Force KC-135 tankers. Yes, I said it, war stories. I normally don't tell war stories, but here are 3 interesting flights in the Connie that I hope you'll enjoy. The first one is called the Purple Spear. We had been in solid clouds near thunderstorms for quite a while when the windshield started to display a light show of what looked like miniature lightning strikes dancing all over the glass. The captain explained, "That's St. Elmo's fire," which is a heavy concentration of static electricity. New to me. Soon after, the captain said, "Hey, Bob, step up here and look out the front windshield." Wow! A purple spear was jutting out from the nose, and it was growing longer as I watched. It looked like a unicorn's horn. It continued to extend forward for several minutes, so I had to go back and check on my panel when, bang! A really, really loud explosion. The cockpit lit up in a blinding light, and a fireball shot out of the throttle pedestal, racing behind my chair, and disappeared under the cockpit door. A wide-eyed flight attendant burst through the door and said, "What was that?" A fireball just raced down the aisle and disappeared into the aft bulkhead. Try that in your Boeing 787. We chuckled and told her what had transpired up in the cockpit. Our vision was slowly returning from that blinding flash. The radios, which had quit working, came back online, and we settled down for what became a routine flight thereafter. Oh, my next little vignette is a very close call. We were descending in moderate icing into the old downtown Harrisburg Airport. It's ringed by low hills and kind of a low spot. Props are all wetted down with the alky slingers. The boots are pumping away, when suddenly, about 5 miles from the outer marker, we started taking on an incredible load of ice, like nothing I have experienced before or since. Did I mention it was a dark and stormy night? It was. At the outer marker, the captain called for METO power, which means maximum accept takeoff. We could feel the old girl wallowing. The ice load was increasing so fast. The weather was reported at minimums, and we all knew there was no go-around tonight. The captain called, "More power, Bob." Just past the threshold, the captain slammed the throttles to the firewall. Connie lurched and then gave up any more intention to fly. We fell onto the concrete with a resounding thud, and never was I so glad to be earthbound again. After the crew departed for the warmth of the office, I did a walk-around under the glare of the terminal floodlights. The old girl was one big popsicle. How she held on with that load of ice for that long is amazing to me. Ah, well, another day of, well, you know. Okay, this one is the Great Blackout. Maybe some of you will remember this particular occurrence. On a crystal clear night, flying from Cleveland to New York on November 9th, 1965, as we approached the New York area, we got a call from air traffic control that New York City was blacked out and directed us to a holding pattern over Newark. Turned out Newark was on another power grid, and the place was its usual blaze of lights. But looking out across the Hudson River, New York City, Long Island, and everything up the Sound was lost in the inky black. Eerie business. A Niagara power failure had blacked out all the East Coast cities to the north of New York City. I have never witnessed so many rotating aircraft beacons as I did in that holding pattern. After a long hold, being laddered down 1,000 feet at a time, we finally landed at Newark. Some years later, I was flying as a first officer on the Boeing 707, and I asked the captain, "Where were you on the night of the blackout?" He replied, "I was flying a Boeing 727 into JFK with an FAA inspector in the jump seat." About 5 miles out, I noticed the runway lights were getting dimmer. But with no comment from the Fed, I just kept coming. The lights were pretty well gone when I touched down, wondering if I was going to get a violation. But I guess the Fed wanted to get home just as much as I did. Taxiing on a totally black surface took a long time, but we finally made it to the gate. Now, if you can indulge me, got a nice little story about Uncle Howard. No article about the Connie would be complete unless it included a few more comments about her Uncle Howard. By the way, the Army really got upset with him when he and Jack Fry delivered a Connie from Burbank to Washington, D.C., setting a speed record. Instead of Army war paint, he had painted it in TWA livery for promotional purposes. That's pure Howard. Anyway, the story I want to tell you is this. One day I was conversing with an old-timer flight engineer, and he told me this story about his association with Uncle Howard. He was Hugh's personal flight engineer, and he would call me up and tell me to go over and prepare ship number so-and-so for one of his trips to nowhere with a bunch of his Hollywood friends. He would call dispatch and say, "Cancel the trip for number so-and-so, I'm using it tonight." The dispatcher would protest, saying, "That airplane is all fueled up and provisioned for Paris tonight." "Cancel it. It's mine tonight," says he. So it was just him and Howard, no co-pilot. He would take off from New York, head east out over the Atlantic, and after setting up for cruise, he would engage the autopilot and say, "Okay, you got it." He would then go back with his pals where the drinking, gambling, and other stuff were in high gear. The flight engineer would mind the store for a few hours. Finally, Howard would return, turn the aircraft around, and head back to New York. "It was his personal toy, and he enjoyed it," said the old flight engineer. By the way, Hugh's major domo, Robert Mayhew, the man who did all of Hugh's bidding for over 30 years, while Hughes stayed in a blacked-out bedroom in his underwear with a bunch of legal pads, a telephone, and a pen, running his billion-dollar real estate and all the other holdings. This man worked for over 30 years for Howard. He never met the man he worked for. What? That's Uncle Howard. So there are many escapades about Uncle Howard, but I have enjoyed this one especially that I just told you. Another one of Uncle Howard's hijinks, he commandeered one of the big L-1649As, loaded it up with his cronies, and flew off to wherever. A couple of weeks later, it was located on a ramp in Canada. TWA demanded to have it returned, but Howard refused. After a lot of wrangling, they finally flew it back on the line. Another twist to my TWA career. Usually a TWA crew member begins on a Douglas, Convair, or Boeing product and retires on the Whale, the 747. But for me, I began with the Lockheed product, and another Lockheed, the wonderful L-1011, retired me. So it was lock to lock, so to speak. This talk is running long, isn't it, dear?
It's perfect.
But would you folks like to hear a short story about how the spruce goose came to be?
Yes.
Sounds unanimous. Remember the little Henry J car? A little tiny Henry J car? Sort of a Pinto-ish type little machine. Well, Henry J. Kaiser was an incredibly wealthy industrialist. He built the 3 largest dams in America, plus the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, and 1,490 so-called Liberty ships, cargo ships for the war effort. His shipyard turned out an entire ship in 4.5 days. But the Nazi subs were sinking his ships at such a disastrous rate that Kaiser wanted to build a fleet of flying cargo ships to carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic where submarines could not shoot them down. Hence, his collaboration with Hughes in 1942. The military gave $18 million to them for 3 HK-1 Hercules aircraft. And we know how that turned out. Thanks for listening, folks.
We'll have time for a few questions, because I'm sure some people have some questions out there. We won't take too long. Since he told a Connie story, I've got to tell a Connie story. I flew on a Lockheed Constellation, the first flight I remember out of Willow Run in January 1953, going to Florida with my parents. And it was one of those ones with the turbo compound engines, because I was sitting right by the engine, and as they're climbing, that turbo compound supercharger was like red hot orange. And the captain came on and said, we're going to shift gears. It's much like going uphill in your car where you shift into second. The engines will come back. You hear a thump. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, their eyeballs are coming out. They're grabbing armrests and doing the Hail Marys. But I'm fascinated. That turbocharger went from bright red to orange to brown, and then went back to the colors again. And the stewardess came by and said, would you like to go up to the cockpit? And I was an airplane nut at that time. I built the models and read the books. And, oh, yeah, I want to go up there. I went up to the cockpit, and the thing I remember first, it was IFR in the cockpit. Everybody in that cockpit was smoking something. The smoke in there could be cut with a knife. But I spent about a half hour up there. The lights were all red, so you could see outside real well. And the captain pointed out, here's Dayton, and there's Columbus. And that flight, we went from Detroit to Miami. We stopped in Lexington, Knoxville, Macon, Daytona Beach to Miami. We left here at 3 in the afternoon, and we got down there at about noon the next day. 15 hours, 5 stops. And the stops went on sometimes for like 2 hours. And, but that was it really stuck in my brain. That was just a fascinating experience. And I had the same thing happen to me as a student pilot. I was in icing conditions in my TS-2A. We were on a student cross country, and there was ice in the clouds. And pretty soon this St. Elmo's fire started building up around the windows. And we're 2 student pilots. We'd never seen this before. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, what's going on? He says, I have no idea. What did they ever told us about this? And it kept building up. And pretty soon it came down the center and went down the console and was starting to go back through the back of the airplane. And we're watching this stream of blue stuff going down there. And it went pop. Big yellow flash ball came on. Autopilot quit. 2 of the radios quit. The hydraulic system went to dump, put all the hydraulic fluid overboard. And, and we were flying this wounded airplane in the clouds. 2 student pilots. We got it back on the ground. We had to use the arresting hook to grab the safety wire because we had no brakes or flaps or anything when we landed. And that was a real adventure. That was my first exposure to that orange ball coming in the cockpit. Okay, who's got some questions for Bobby? Right here. Right here. Yeah. Stand up.
I heard earlier in the talk that the Connie could hit 350 miles per hour cruise speed.
That's correct.
Was it capable, an all-out, could it hit 400? Not with passengers, but I mean, was the plane capable of hitting 400 miles?
I think if you nosed it over a little bit, maybe, but we never experimented with that. Hey, here's one you might get a kick out of. Remember I was talking about that real short flight when describing all the pyrotechnics of the takeoff, fire, and coming into land and all that. We had a little milk run with no passengers, just the United States mail bags from Baltimore to Washington National. I mean, it's just, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes or something. This captain I flew with one night, boy, did he have it in for Lyndon Baines Johnson. He hated that guy. Can you imagine today, with the security that we have, we took off from Washington National. I don't know how low we were, but we went over the White House with those props screaming in low pitch. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. And as I was told later, about the second time this happened, Lady Bird got on the horn to the FAA, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, right here.
Yes, sir.
In checking the engine, you talk about the walking gear. Does that make sense to you?
I know exactly what you mean. The old Twin Beaches also had it. But
Maybe the people like to know what you mean by that.
well, the way the landing gear was built was in order to make a very short pirouette turn. Let's say, thank you. Let's say you had a tight spot on the ramp. With the walking gear, the outboard set of wheels, you're making a right turn. So the left-hand gear actually walked back and forth and allowed the Connie to make an extremely tight turnaround when it was needed. That's all I know.
Well, now, when you put on the parking brakes and bring your power up to check the engine, did the gear walk up a little bit on you? And then we relax the power, it would walk back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This airplane had a soul. I'm telling you. I love the old girl. She was my introduction to big airplanes. And the military guys are all jet jocks. And they said, propellers? What? I mean, they just hated being on the Connie. And I'm like, I couldn't say anything, but I was loving it. I knew props, you know? Carburetors and all that stuff. I loved it. And what a nice introduction to learn how your career was going to go in the airlines by being a flight engineer where you interacted directly with the mechanics and with everybody on the ground, unlike the pilots, okay, that only talk to the dispatchers. Kind of like the Cabots only talk to God or something like that. But it was great. It was a great introduction to a wonderful career with a great airline.
Good night.
You heard it.
As a flight engineer, because you mentioned that it takes 2 hours to prep a plane before you take off. Now, as far as now, is it if you're hopping along? Let's say he hopped a flight from Detroit to Nashville to so and so. Now, once you land and you park the plane and you get back on, do you have to go through that flight check again?
Not always, because if let's say the way Randy was hip hopping all that way to Florida, the Connie might fuel through 2 stations where we only had to get paperwork and maybe take off some baggage and put some new people on. So it was quite quick. It could be quite quick. You didn't have to walk the wings only when there was a fuel up. And that might not occur if the legs were short. You might go, for instance, Boston, Albany, Binghamton, Pittsburgh, before you took on any fuel.
Did you have a navigator on board when you...
Oh, no. No. They used the VORs. It was the 2 pilots up front with the VORs. Yeah. Just a very few of the navigators became instructors at our downtown Kansas City training center, but most of them were just out on the street.
All right, I'm sure Bob, if he wants to stay here afterwards and take your questions, would he be happy to do that? But we're going to wrap this up right now. And let me have the microphone. I'll give it right back to you. Don't forget, we have another presentation coming up on December 6th. Joel Stone from the Detroit Historic Society will speak to us about Detroit during the Roaring '20s.